In the early 19th century, Europe was on the brink of another massive war. Napoleon Bonaparte's empire was expanding at an unstoppable pace, and the great powers of the continent scrambled to unite against him. But as history would soon show, standing against Napoleon was easier said than done. Welcome to ASMR War History. If you enjoy listening and learning about the history of the world's wars, make sure to like this video and subscribe to the channel. Clicking the little bell icon doesn't hurt either. Now, let's begin our journey into the War of the Third Coalition, starting off with a summary. In the early years of the 19th century, Europe erupted into war once again as Napoleon Bonaparte's growing empire faced off against a new alliance. The War of the Third Coalition, fought from the year 1805 to 1806, was the first major conflict of the Napoleonic Wars. On one side stood France, its client states, and its ally Spain. On the other, an alliance led by Britain, Austria, and Russia, along with Naples, Sicily, and Sweden. Prussia, though uneasy about Napoleon's growing power, remained on the sidelines. Britain had already been at war with France since the breakdown of the Peace of Amiens in the year 1803. From that moment on, the British Isles were under the constant shadow of a potential French invasion. However, any hope of French naval supremacy was shattered in October of 1805, when the Royal Navy secured an overwhelming victory at the Battle of Trafalgar, ensuring Britain's dominance at sea. Meanwhile, tensions on the continent escalated. Napoleon's growing influence in Italy and Germany, particularly his arrest and execution of the Duc d'Enghien, pushed Austria and Russia into action, leading them to join Britain in forming the Third Coalition. The war would be decided on land, and Napoleon moved swiftly. The Ulm campaign, a masterful strategic manoeuvre carried out between late August and mid-October of 1805, saw the French encircle and capture an entire Austrian army. Then, in early December, Napoleon secured one of his most legendary victories at the Battle of Austerlitz, crushing a combined Austro-Russian force led by Tsar Alexander I. With their army shattered, Austria had little choice but to sue for peace. On December 26th, Austria and France signed the Treaty of Pressburg, effectively dissolving the coalition. The treaty forced Austria to cede a significant territory in Italy and Germany, pay an indemnity of 40 million francs, and allow Russian troops safe passage back home. Napoleon's triumph at Austerlitz also paved the way for the creation of the Confederation of the Rhine, a coalition of German client states loyal to France, which pledged to provide an army of 63,000 men. The war had ended, but the effects were far-reaching. The Holy Roman Empire, a political entity that had lasted for nearly 1,000 years, ceased to exist when Emperor Francis II abdicated the throne in the year 1806, becoming Francis I of Austria. But while Napoleon had defeated Austria, neither Russia nor Britain was ready to give up the fight. With Britain's navy guarding Sicily against French invasion and Prussia growing increasingly wary of Napoleon's influence in Central Europe, the seeds of yet another war had already been sown. Soon, the War of the Fourth Coalition would begin, but that's a topic for another video. Historians, as they like to do, still debate exactly when the War of the Third Coalition began and ended. From Britain's perspective, the war started on May 18th, 1803, when it declared war on France. But at that point, Britain was alone. It wasn't until December of 1804 that Sweden joined the conflict, and not until April 11th, 1805, that Russia officially entered the alliance. Britain and Russia ratified their treaty in mid-July, followed by Austria on August 9th, and Naples, Sicily on September 11th, finally forming a full-fledged coalition against Napoleon. Meanwhile, Bavaria aligned itself with France on August 25th, followed by Württemberg on September 5th. But for the first part of the war, no significant battles took place on land between France and the coalition, aside from Britain's naval campaign at Trafalgar. This was partly because Napoleon had been preparing to invade Britain itself, but that plan was scrapped on August 27th, when he redirected his massive invasion force toward Austria instead. The first major clash between Napoleon's forces and the coalition came with the Ulm campaign in late September. And just a few months later, the war's defining battle, Austerlitz, would bring the entire conflict to a decisive turning point. After Austria's crushing defeat, the Peace of Pressburg was signed on December 26th, forcing Austria out of the war and effectively breaking the coalition. Many historians mark this as the war's conclusion. However, this interpretation overlooks the Mediterranean theatre, where fighting continued. In February of 1806, Napoleon's forces invaded Naples, forcing a swift retreat by the Anglo-Russian troops stationed there. Some historians argue that this Italian campaign should be seen as part of the earlier war of the Second Coalition rather than the Third. Others criticise how the Mediterranean front is often sidelined, with most narratives focusing only on land battles in Central Europe and the naval showdown at Trafalgar. But enough about historians and their squabbles. Let's rewind and explore the War of the Third Coalition. In March of 1802, war in Europe came to a temporary halt, but few believed the peace would last. Napoleon's growing ambitions made sure of that. The treaties of Luneville and Amiens had ended the Second Coalition War, yet tensions between France and Britain began rising again within months. Napoleon's expansionist policies were a clear warning. He consolidated his power in Italy, annexed Piedmont, and kept his troops stationed in the Netherlands despite agreements to withdraw them. His increasing involvement in the Caribbean and hints at renewing French interest in Egypt and the Middle East only heightened British concerns. The Treaty of Amiens had required Britain to return captured territories, including Minorca to Spain and Malta to the Order of St. John. In exchange, France was to leave Egypt and Naples and guarantee the independence of Portugal and the Ionian Islands. But Napoleon had no intention of keeping his side of the bargain. The British, in turn, refused to abandon Malta, seeing it as vital to blocking any French expansion in the Mediterranean. As tensions reached a breaking point, Napoleon made his position clear on March 13th, 1803, in a heated exchange with British Ambassador Lord Whitworth. Britain responded with a declaration of war on May 18th. By the time Napoleon crowned himself emperor, on December 2nd, 1804, it was evident that his ambitions would not be contained. His annexation of Genoa, Parma, and Piacenza, along with his self-coronation as King of Italy, left no doubt about his intentions. Britain took the lead in forming a new coalition against him, with Prime Minister William Pitt the Younger securing an alliance with Russia and Austria. Their demands were clear. France must withdraw from Italy, dissolve the Batavian Republic, and restore Swiss independence. When negotiations failed, Britain, Austria, and Russia officially signed a treaty on August 9th, 1805, forming the Third Coalition. Prussia, however, remained neutral. Napoleon countered by strengthening alliances within the Holy Roman Empire. He secured the loyalty of Württemberg, Bavaria, and Baden, rewarding them with territorial expansions under the Reichsdeputations Hauptschluss of February 25, 1803. His strategy was to weaken Austria, while ensuring these German states remained too small to challenge France. In the meantime, Napoleon had assembled a massive force at Boulogne, originally intended for an invasion of Britain. Though they never crossed the Channel, the men of the Army of England were drilled to perfection. The constant training and inspections paid off. These troops would soon form the core of the Grande Armée, an army that would dominate European battlefields. At its core were 200,000 men, divided into 7 corps, each capable of operating independently or in coordination with the others. A reserve cavalry force of 22,000, complete with cuirassiers, dragoons and artillery, added to its striking power. By 1805, the Grande Armée had swelled to 350,000 men, equipped, trained, and led by an officer corps unmatched in skill. On the other side, the forces of the coalition faced serious challenges. The Imperial Russian Army still bore the marks of 18th century military traditions. There were no permanent formations above the regimental level, and command positions were filled largely from aristocratic circles, including many foreign officers. Russian soldiers were subjected to harsh discipline, often beaten into obedience, and many lower-ranking officers lacked the training needed to maneuver their troops effectively. However, Russian artillery was formidable, and its crews fought tenaciously to prevent their guns from falling into enemy hands. Austria, too, had been reforming its army. Archduke Charles, brother of Emperor Francis, had worked to modernize Austria's forces since 1801, limiting the power of the Hofkriegsrat, the military political council that had long dictated Austria's strategic decisions. Charles was Austria's most capable general, but his influence waned at court. Against his advice, Austria chose war with France, and command of its army fell to Karl Mack, who reorganized the infantry just before the conflict began. His changes, however, came too fast. Officers had little time to adapt, and Austrian formations lacked the cohesion needed for battle. Austrian cavalry, on the other hand, was widely regarded as the best in Europe. But rather than using them in massed formations as the French did, many cavalry units were scattered among infantry divisions, diminishing their effectiveness. In August of 1805, Napoleon shifted his focus from Britain to the heart of Europe. His eyes were no longer set on the English Channel, but on the Rhine, where new threats had emerged. Austria and Russia were mobilizing, and war had arrived. The campaign that would decide the fate of the Third Coalition had begun. The opening move belonged to Napoleon, and his target was the Austrian army stationed in Germany under General Karl Mack. Mack believed Austria's best defence lay in sealing off the Black Forest, a region that had been a battleground in the past. But he made a crucial mistake. He assumed Napoleon would attack through the mountains. Instead, Mack concentrated his forces around Ulm, believing that the city's strong fortifications would hold long enough for reinforcements to arrive from Russia. Ulm, situated on the Danube, was strategically important, but Mack was walking into a trap. Austria's overall strategy was divided. The Austerlitz Council had chosen to make northern Italy the main theatre of operations. Archduke Charles led nearly 100,000 troops across the Adige River, while Archduke John commanded 23,000 in the Tyrol region. Mack, in command of 72,000 men, was tasked with invading Bavaria and holding the line at Ulm. To support the coalition, Austria also sent forces to assist Sweden in Pomerania and Britain in Naples, though these efforts were mostly intended to stretch French resources thin. Napoleon had no intention of focusing his war effort in Italy. Instead, he devised a bold plan. Rather than attacking Austria head-on, he would encircle Mack's army. The Grande Armée, consisting of 210,000 men, would sweep into Germany from Boulogne and cut the Austrians off from their Russian allies. To mislead Mack, Napoleon ordered Marshal Joachim Murat to conduct cavalry manoeuvres in the Black Forest, giving the impression of a direct advance. But the real attack would come from elsewhere. To ensure success, Napoleon ordered supporting offensives in other regions. Marshal André Masséna was sent to engage Archduke Charles in Italy with 50,000 troops. Marshal Gouvion Saint-Cyr led 20,000 men toward Naples, while Marshal Guillaume Brune remained in Boulogne with 30,000, guarding against a potential British landing. Meanwhile, Napoleon's commanders prepared the battlefield. General Anne-Jean-Marie René Savary, head of the planning staff, mapped out routes between the Rhine and Danube. The left wing of the Grande Armée moved through Hanover and Utrecht toward Württemberg. The right and centre forces, coming from the Channel coast, assembled near Mannheim and Strasbourg. Murat's cavalry demonstrations continued in the Black Forest, keeping Austrian attention fixed westward. But as Mack focused on this illusion, French forces moved southeast, capturing Augsburg and cutting off Austrian supply lines. By late September, Napoleon's forces struck with speed and precision. Mack decided to hold his position along the Iller River, anchoring his defence on Ulm. However, he failed to anticipate the scale of Napoleon's manoeuvre. The French army was not advancing directly from the west as he expected. It was closing in from the north and east. On September 22nd, Mack reaffirmed his decision to defend Ulm, but in the final days of the month, the French launched a rapid advance toward the Austrian rear. Mack still believed that Napoleon would not risk violating Prussian territory, but that assumption was shattered when news arrived that Marshal Jean-Baptiste Bernadotte's First Corps had marched through Prussian Ansbach. Faced with this revelation, Mack made a fateful choice. Rather than retreating south, where he could have saved much of his army, he chose to stand his ground. Napoleon was unsure of Mack's exact intentions, but he suspected the Austrians were massing around Ulm. His agents incorrectly reported the presence of a large Austrian force at Ingolstadt, exaggerating its size. Nevertheless, Napoleon decided to act. On October 5th, he ordered Marshal Michel Ney to join Marshals Jean Lannes, Nicolas Soult, and Murat in crossing the Danube at Donauwörth. The French encirclement was tightening, but it was not yet complete. Some Austrian forces under General Franz von Kienmeyer managed to withdraw eastward. Napoleon, now convinced that Ulm was the key to the campaign, ordered the bulk of his forces to concentrate around Donauwörth. The following day, October 6th, 3 French corps advanced toward Ulm to cut off Mack's last escape route. On the 8th of October, with Napoleon's forces closing in, General Mack realised the danger of his position. Determined to break free from the tightening French grip, he ordered his army to concentrate around Günzburg, hoping to strike at Napoleon's lines of communication. At the same time, he instructed General Kienmeyer to draw the French further east toward Munich and Augsburg. But Napoleon had no intention of allowing the Austrians to dictate the terms of battle. He recognised that seizing the bridges at Günzburg would provide a strategic advantage, and sent Marshal Ney's corps to capture them, unaware that the bulk of the Austrian army was heading to the same destination. Before Ney could reach Günzburg, the first major clash of the campaign erupted at Wertingen. Inexplicably, Mack had ordered General Alfenburg to move 5,000 infantry and 400 cavalry from Günzburg to Wertingen, despite the precarious position of his forces. Uncertain and isolated, Alfenburg soon found himself facing the vanguard of Napoleon's army. Murat's cavalry arrived first, leading the assault, followed by Oudinot's grenadiers, who moved to encircle the Austrian force from the north and west. Alfenburg attempted to retreat but was too slow. His forces were overwhelmed. By the time the fighting ended, nearly the entire Austrian division had been destroyed, with as many as 2,000 men taken prisoner. The defeat at Wertingen convinced Mack to shift his army to the left bank of the Danube rather than attempting a direct retreat eastward. To do so, he needed to cross at Günzburg. On the 8th of October, Ney, operating under Berthier's orders, launched an attack on Ulm, believing the Austrian presence there to be weaker than it actually was. As part of this push, Ney sent Malher's 3rd Division to capture the bridges at Günzburg. The French forces encountered a detachment of Tyrolean Jaegers, and captured 200 of them, including their commander, General d'Asprey, along with 2 cannons. But the Austrians were not ready to give up Günzburg so easily. Mack reinforced the town's defences with 3 battalions of infantry and 20 cannons. Malher's division launched several determined assaults but failed to break through. In response, Mack sent General Goulet with 7 infantry battalions and 14 cavalry squadrons to repair the destroyed bridges. But this force was swiftly repelled by the delayed arrival of the French 59th Infantry Regiment. The struggle for Günzburg intensified. Fierce fighting ensued, but by the end of the day, the French had established a foothold on the right bank of the Danube. While the battle raged at Günzburg, Ney had also dispatched General Loysen's 2nd Division to seize the bridges at Elchingen. The Austrian defences there were light, and Loysen quickly secured his objective. Having lost most of their crossings over the Danube, the Austrians were forced to retreat back to Ulm. By the 10th of October, the situation for Mack was growing more desperate. Ney's corps had made significant gains. Malher's division had crossed the Danube, Loysen's division controlled Elchingen, and Dupont's division was advancing toward Ulm. But within the walls of the city, the Austrian command was in turmoil. The demoralised Austrian army reached Ulm in the early hours of the 10th. Mack hesitated, uncertain of his next move. For an entire day, the Austrians remained inactive, while Napoleon, unaware of the full strength of Mack's forces at Ulm, mistakenly assumed that the bulk of the Austrian army was retreating eastward. This misunderstanding led Napoleon to focus on countering a potential Russian threat, prompting him to place Murat in command of the right wing of the army, overseeing Ney and Lannes. On the 11th of October, Ney pushed forward once again. His 2nd and 3rd divisions marched along the right bank of the Danube, while Dupont's division, supported by a division of dragoons, advanced directly toward Ulm. However, Ney had vastly underestimated the Austrian presence. Dupont's troops, unaware of the full scale of the Austrian army, collided with 4 regiments at Bolfingen. The French launched several determined assaults, but the Austrians held firm. Sensing an opportunity, the Austrians flooded reinforcements into the battle, attempting to envelop Dupont's forces and deliver a decisive blow. Dupont, recognising the danger, countered with a bold surprise attack on Jungingen, capturing 1,000 Austrian troops. But the Austrians quickly regrouped, forcing the French to withdraw to Haslach. Despite the setback, the battle had revealed a critical truth. Napoleon now understood that the bulk of the Austrian army was still in Ulm. Reacting to this discovery, Napoleon ordered Marshal Soult and Marshal Marmont to move toward the Iller, bringing the full weight of 4 infantry corps and 1 cavalry corps against Mack. Meanwhile, Davout, Bernadotte, and the Bavarians remained stationed around Munich, guarding against any Russian or Austrian reinforcements. With his escape routes closing, Mack faced growing dissent among his commanders. The Austrian leadership was in chaos. Archduke Ferdinand openly opposed Mack's decisions, accusing him of issuing contradictory orders that left the army marching back and forth without clear direction. On the 13th of October, Mack attempted a breakout. He ordered 2 columns to leave Ulm, one under General Riesch to secure the bridge at Elchingen, and the other under General Werneck to push north with the army's heavy artillery. But Ney acted swiftly. Leading his corps toward Elchingen, he launched a determined assault on the Austrian positions. The battlefield was a steep, partially wooded floodplain rising toward the town, which offered a commanding view of the surrounding area. The French stormed the Austrian defences, clearing the pickets and charging up the hill. In a dramatic bayonet assault, they captured the abbey at the top, driving Riesch's forces into full retreat. The Austrian cavalry, attempting to regroup, was also swept aside. For his victory at Elchingen, Ney would later be granted the title Duke of Elchingen. Meanwhile, to the north, Murat and Dupont continued their attacks, forcing Vernec's retreating force into a desperate withdrawal. By the night of the 14th, 2 French corps had encircled the Austrian encampments at Michelsberg, just outside Ulm. Mack's situation was now critical. With Marmont and the Imperial Guard cutting off any escape to the south, and Soult moving in from Memmingen, the Austrians had nowhere to run. The final blow came on the 15th. Ney's forces charged the Austrian defences at Michelsberg, forcing them back into Ulm. The next day, the French began bombarding the city itself. Austrian morale collapsed. Mack realised there was no hope of rescue. On the 17th of October, Napoleon's envoy, Ségur, negotiated terms with Mack. The Austrians agreed to surrender on the 25th if no reinforcements arrived by then. But as news spread of additional Austrian capitulations at Heidenheim and Neresheim, Mack lost what little hope remained. 5 days ahead of schedule, on the 20th of October, he formally surrendered. Over 10,000 Austrian troops managed to slip away, but the vast majority of the army remained trapped. On the 21st of October, with the Grande Armée formed in a semicircle around the city, the Austrian garrison marched out and laid down their arms. Napoleon had achieved a staggering victory. In a campaign lasting barely a month, he had encircled and destroyed an entire Austrian army without fighting a major pitched battle. On the 21st of October, 1805, in the cold waters off the southwest coast of Spain, 2 great naval forces clashed in what would become one of the most decisive battles in history. The British Royal Navy, led by Admiral Horatio Nelson, faced the combined fleets of France and Spain under Admiral Pierre-Charles Villeneuve. The stakes were nothing less than the fate of Napoleon's grand strategy. If Villeneuve's fleet could seize control of the English Channel, France would finally have the chance to launch an invasion of Britain. But Nelson had no intention of letting that happen. The French and Spanish fleets, numbering 33 ships of the line, set sail from Cadiz on the 18th of October, with the massive 4-decked Santissima Trinidad as their flagship. They were met by Nelson's 27 British warships, vastly outnumbered, but carrying a reputation for discipline, firepower, and seamanship. Nelson, knowing that conventional tactics would not be enough to overcome the numerical disadvantage, devised a bold and unorthodox plan. Rather than engage in a standard line of battle, he would divide his fleet into 2 columns and drive straight through the enemy formation, shattering its cohesion and isolating individual ships. Villeneuve, despite suspecting that Nelson might attempt something unconventional, failed to properly prepare for this assault. As the British fleet closed in, the French and Spanish line remained vulnerable. At approximately noon, Nelson's flagship, HMS Victory, led the charge, sailing head-on into a barrage of enemy fire. The British ships were hammered by broadside after broadside as they approached, but Nelson's strategy worked. His fleet split the Allied formation into 3 disorganised fragments. The French and Spanish vanguard, led by Admiral Gravina, was cut off, leaving Villeneuve's flagship Bucentaure and the rear section of his fleet exposed. In the chaos that followed, 20 Allied ships were either sunk or captured. The British lost none. But the victory came at a cost. Nelson, standing on the quarterdeck of Victory, was struck by a musket ball fired from the rigging of the French redoutable. He was carried below deck, where he lived just long enough to hear that the battle had been won. His final words, "Now I am satisfied. Thank God I have done my duty." Villeneuve was taken prisoner, his fleet shattered. Admiral Gravina, though he managed to escape with a portion of the fleet, succumbed to his wounds 6 months later. The Battle of Trafalgar ended Napoleon's hopes of invading Britain and cemented British naval supremacy for the rest of the war. Meanwhile, on land, the armies of Europe were on the move. With his victory at Ulm, Napoleon's forces pressed forward, pursuing the retreating Austrians and Russians toward Vienna. The Russian general, Mikhail Kutuzov, attempted to slow the French advance, fighting a series of desperate rearguard actions. On the 5th of November, at Amstetten, his troops successfully delayed the French. 2 days later, the Russians crossed the Danube, destroying the bridges behind them to buy more time. Napoleon, however, was relentless. Kutuzov, determined to lure the French into a trap, feigned a retreat, leading Marshal Mortier to believe that the Russian army was withdrawing further east. It was a deception. On the 11th of November, Mortier ordered General Gazan's division to attack what they assumed was a small rearguard force at the village of Stein. Instead, they walked straight into an ambush. 3 Russian columns, hidden in the mountain defiles above the Danube, surrounded the French troops. The battle raged until nightfall, and only the arrival of Dupont's division prevented a complete disaster. Even so, Gazan lost nearly 40% of his men, including hundreds taken prisoner. The Russians, though victorious, suffered heavy casualties themselves. Just days later, Napoleon's forces made a bold move. On the 13th of November, Marshals Murat and Lannes seized a bridge over the Danube at Vienna without firing a shot. They tricked the Austrian defenders into believing an armistice had been signed, and then rushed the bridge while the guards were distracted. It was an audacious and humiliating blow to the Allies. As both armies gathered near the town of Brünn, Napoleon prepared for what he knew would be the decisive battle of the campaign. His forces numbered 75,000 men with over 150 cannon. The Allies, led by Tsar Alexander and Emperor Francis, commanded 73,000 troops, the majority of them Russian, with more than 300 cannons. The battlefield was dominated by key terrain features: the Santon and Zuren hills in the north, the Pratzen heights at the centre, and the Goldbach stream running along the western flank. Napoleon, ever the strategist, studied the ground carefully. He told his marshals, "Gentlemen, examine this ground well, for it will be a battlefield. Each of you will have your part to play." On the 1st of December, the Allied commanders met to finalise their battle plan. Their goal was to strike Napoleon's right flank, believing it to be weak, while launching diversionary attacks on his left. The Russian Imperial Guard was held in reserve, while Bagration's forces defended their own right flank. Napoleon, however, had set a trap. He deliberately left his right flank exposed, baiting the Allies into an attack. In reality, reinforcements under Davout were already marching hard from Vienna, ready to support the French right when the time came. Meanwhile, Napoleon's main attack would not be on the flanks at all. It would come straight through the centre. At dawn on the 2nd of December, the battle began. The Allies launched a furious assault on the villages of Telnitz and Sokolnitz, held by the French Third Line Regiment. Fighting was brutal, with the towns changing hands multiple times. Davout's forces arrived just in time to stabilise the right flank, preventing a full collapse. But all of this had played into Napoleon's hands. By mid-morning, he judged that the Allied centre had been dangerously weakened. Turning to Marshal Soult, he asked, "How long will it take your men to reach the Pratzen heights?" Soult replied, "Less than 20 minutes, sire." Napoleon gave the order, "One sharp blow, and the war is over." Soult's corps surged forward, striking the Pratzen heights with overwhelming force. Russian and Austrian troops fought desperately, but within an hour their lines began to collapse. French skirmishers pushed forward, delivering deadly volleys. Meanwhile, to the north, the Russian Imperial Guard counterattacked against Vandame's division. For a moment, It seemed as though the battle might turn. But Napoleon had planned for this. He sent in his own Imperial Guard cavalry, smashing through the Russian lines. With support from Bernadotte's corps and concentrated artillery fire, the Russians were driven back. By early afternoon, the battle had decisively shifted in Napoleon's favour. The Allied army was now split in two, with thousands of troops attempting to retreat. At the southern end of the battlefield, some Russian forces tried to escape across the frozen lakes of Sachon. French artillery, aiming not at the soldiers but at the ice itself, shattered the surface. Hundreds of men, along with artillery and horses, were swallowed by the freezing water. As the sun set, the battlefield was littered with the dead and dying. Napoleon had achieved one of the greatest victories of his career. The Allied army was broken. Within days, the Austrians would sue for peace. The Third Coalition, like those before it, had crumbled under the weight of the Grande Armée. By the autumn of 1805, while Napoleon's Grande Armée was encircling and crushing Austrian forces in Central Europe, the battle for control of Italy raged on. The Austrian army of Italy, commanded by Archduke Charles, faced off against the French army of Italy under Marshal André Masséna. The campaign reached a critical point on the 18th of October, when French forces secured a bridgehead over the Adige River at Verona. The decisive moment came between the 29th and 31st of October, when the Battle of Caldiero unfolded. Outnumbered but relentless, Masséna's army defeated the superior Austrian force, forcing Charles into retreat. By November, the Austrian withdrawal turned into a series of desperate rearguard actions as they fought to slow the advancing French vanguard. Meanwhile, French and Italian troops under General Gouvion Saint-Cyr encircled Venice, cutting it off from the rest of the Austrian-held territory. Charles's forces finally managed to establish a defensive line behind the Isonzo River on the 14th of November, temporarily halting the French advance. However, one Austrian detachment of 4,400 men, left behind in the retreat, was swiftly surrounded and captured by French forces under General Jean Renier at the Battle of Castelfranco Veneto on the 24th of November. As the Austrians withdrew from Italy, a new front opened to the south. The Kingdom of Naples, under King Ferdinand IV, found itself caught between a French army gathering on its border and an Anglo-Russian force sent to protect it. For months, British and Russian troops had garrisoned Naples, wary of a potential invasion. But when news arrived that Napoleon had decisively defeated the Austrians and Russians at Austerlitz, the situation changed dramatically. The Russian army promptly withdrew, and the British, unwilling to fight alone, abandoned the mainland and fell back to the island of Sicily. This left the Neapolitan kingdom defenceless. From his headquarters in Bologna, Masséna reorganized his forces into what would now be called the Army of Naples. Though officially commanded by Napoleon's brother, Joseph Bonaparte, the real leadership fell to Masséna. On the 9th of February 1806, the invasion began. Within 2 days, Ferdinand had fled Naples, taking refuge in Sicily under British naval protection. The French entered the city unopposed. By the end of February, the Neapolitan kingdom had all but fallen, except for 2 strongholds. One was the fortress city of Gaeta, north of Naples, which continued to resist. The other was Calabria, at the southern tip of Italy, where remnants of the Neapolitan army had regrouped. Ferdinand, hoping to repeat the success of the Calabrian uprising of 1799, which had helped drive out the French during the War of the Second Coalition, expected his people to rise against the invaders once more. But no such rebellion occurred. On the 3rd of March, General Jean Renier led 10,000 French troops into Calabria, facing little resistance. A week later, on the 10th of March, he met the last organised Neapolitan forces at the Battle of Campo Tenese. The result was a crushing French victory. With the defeat of his army, Ferdinand had no choice but to surrender his throne. The following day, Joseph Bonaparte was crowned King of Naples. But Napoleon's conquest of southern Italy was far from over. The fall of the Neapolitan army was only the beginning of a much greater challenge. While Gaeta remained under siege, a new and far more dangerous enemy emerged, the people of Calabria. Regnier's troops, cut off from consistent supply lines, were forced to live off the land, seizing food and resources from the local population. By the end of March, resistance had begun to boil over. Small groups of partisans took up arms, launching ambushes against isolated French detachments. Before long, entire villages rose up in open revolt. The French, unprepared for a popular uprising, struggled to contain the growing insurgency. Meanwhile, Gaeta continued to defy the French siege. British warships resupplied the fortress by sea, while the Neapolitan garrison launched aggressive sorties against their besiegers. The fortress held out longer than expected, preventing Massena from sending reinforcements south to Calabria. Sensing an opportunity, the British dispatched an expeditionary force under General Sir John Stuart. Landing in Calabria, the British forces engaged the French in battle near the town of Maida. Stuart's men won a clear victory, proving that the French army was not invincible. But despite this success, British commanders failed to press their advantage. They did not reinforce Stuart's force, nor did they attempt to relieve the siege of Gaeta. By mid-July, the French artillery had finally brought their full firepower to bear on the fortress. With its walls crumbling, Gaeta surrendered on the 18th of July. This freed up Massena's forces, allowing him to march south to reinforce Regnier's embattled army in Calabria. Recognizing that they were now severely outnumbered, the British abandoned the mainland and withdrew to Sicily, leaving the Calabrian rebels to face the French alone. What followed was a brutal guerrilla war unlike anything Napoleon's armies had faced before. In a desperate attempt to crush the rebellion, Regnier unleashed a campaign of terror. Entire villages were razed, executions were carried out en masse, and the population was subjected to horrific reprisals. Despite these brutal tactics, the revolt was not fully suppressed until 1807. For the first time in the Napoleonic Wars, the French had encountered a kind of warfare they could not easily control. The lessons learned in Calabria would be painfully revisited in the years to come, when Napoleon's armies found themselves locked in an even deadlier insurgency, this time in Spain. In the span of just 3 months, Napoleon had shattered the balance of power in Europe. His armies had marched into Vienna, crushed 2 of the continent's greatest military forces, and left the Austrian Empire humiliated. The victory at Austerlitz was more than just a battle. It was a signal to the rest of Europe that France now ruled the land. For the first time in modern history, the rigid power structures of the 18th century had been broken. No longer were capitals untouchable. No longer were alliances enough to keep France in check. Napoleon had rewritten the rules of war. On the 4th of December, France and Austria signed a truce. 22 days later, the Treaty of Pressburg formally ended the war. Austria was forced to recognise all French territorial gains from the treaties of Campo Formio and Lunéville, cede vast amounts of land to Napoleon's German allies in Bavaria, Württemberg and Baden, and pay a crushing indemnity of 40 million francs. Venice was handed over to the Kingdom of Italy, another of Napoleon's puppet states. The Russian army was allowed to withdraw, while the French remained in control of southern Germany. Austria had been dealt a devastating blow, but it was not a total collapse. France, however, was only getting stronger. By the summer of 1806, Napoleon took the next step in his reshaping of Europe. In July, he created the Confederation of the Rhine, a collection of German client states that pledged loyalty to France and promised to provide an army of 63,000 men. As a result, these states left the Holy Roman Empire, and the ancient institution was formally dissolved. The Austrian Emperor Francis II, the last ruler of the empire, abdicated the throne. The Holy Roman Empire had existed for over 8 centuries. Napoleon had erased it in a matter of months. But not everyone would accept this new order. Prussia, long the dominant force in Central Europe, saw Napoleon's growing influence as a direct threat to its status. As France reshaped Germany, Prussian leaders grew increasingly restless. In late 1806, just months after Austria's defeat, Prussia would take up arms against France. What followed would be yet another brutal war, a war that would see Napoleon's armies marching through Berlin itself. In Italy, the situation remained locked in a stalemate. The British and Sicilian armies continued to hold the island of Sicily, where the Bourbon King Ferdinand remained in exile. On the mainland, Napoleon's appointed rulers controlled Naples. In 1808, Joachim Murat, one of Napoleon's most trusted marshals, was made King of Naples after Joseph Bonaparte was sent to rule Spain. Murat made several attempts to invade Sicily, but each one ended in failure. Though he once managed to gain a temporary foothold, the British drove him back every time. The War of the Third Coalition had come to an end, but the bloodshed was far from over. In total, the French lost over 12,000 killed and 22,000 wounded during the campaign, with another 5,000 taken prisoner. The Austrian army suffered even greater losses: 20,000 killed or wounded, and 70,000 captured. The Russians lost 25,000 killed or wounded, and another 25,000 taken as prisoners. In Naples, the entire Neapolitan army, 22,000 men, was wiped out, with only 2,000 managing to escape to Sicily. The War of the Third Coalition had reshaped Europe, but it had not brought lasting peace. Napoleon had won yet another stunning victory, but his empire was not yet unchallenged. As France marched forward, new enemies were already gathering. The Fourth Coalition was just around the corner, and the wars of Napoleon were far from finished. But those wars are tales for future videos. Thank you for listening. If you enjoyed the video, please make sure to give it a like. It helps tremendously. To follow for more of the Napoleonic Wars and other war histories, make sure to subscribe to ASMR War History. Until next time, sleep well, my friends.